Welcome back. This video is going to walk you through some ideas from my book called Relativism, A Guide for the Perplexed. Came out a few years ago now, and this video I'm going to walk you through a section on relativism and politics, and it's I'm calling it the case of Alasdair McIntyre. So Professor McIntyre he passed away just a couple years ago. I actually got to meet him briefly. I did part of my dissertation on him in relationship to Richard Rorty, and Hilary Putnam. These were the three main thinkers that I covered when I was in graduate school. And his work, McIntyre's work, has shifted a lot over the years of his career. And I think philosophers can learn quite a bit from reading his ideas. I agree with some of them, but not all of them, this is mostly the case with almost all philosophers. I agree with every single thing a philosopher maintains, but I have a great deal of respect for his work and commitment to doing good philosophy over the years. And having said that, I will just read a little bit. So this is from quotation from philosopher Williamson, Rene de Visma Williamson, on the challenge of political relativism. Came out in the 1940s. And here's what he said. The ironical aspect of the relativist position is that those who take it are also the very ones who champion the practical most profusely, little realizing how utterly impractical applied relativism is. With benevolent and impartial indifference for all and approval for none, you can say that every protagonist of discordant views is right, but you cannot govern a nation that way unless you want disorder, anarchy, and chaos. Again, that's from a philosopher. Williamson is his last name. Rene de Visma Williamson, in an article called The Challenge of Political Relativism from the Journal of Politics, Volume 9, Number 2, pages 144 through 177 from 1947. I just want to stop and think about that for a little while. Relativism in politics leads to disorder, anarchy, and chaos. One way of thinking about relativism in politics is to abstract one's conception of the political from particular policy debates. Should the United States be at war in fill in the blank? Iraq, Iran, some other country. Or should we increase federal funding for education? Not advocating for either one of these things. I'm just saying that to think about politics, relativism in politics, is to abstract one's conception of the political from particular policy debates and consider the most fundamental questions of the nature of political justice, of the good life that might obtain not only for individual human beings, but also for human beings living together in community. One contemporary philosopher who presents a very thoughtful account of political philosophy in this sense is Alasdair McIntyre, especially in his book, Whose Justice, Which Rationality? McIntyre's reflections in that book, as well as in his other major writings, offer some important lessons on the relationships between relativism and other areas of philosophy, especially epistemic relativism, and political life. From his early works in the history of ethics and political philosophy up through the time of this writing, in the early mid-2010s maybe, McIntyre presents an account of what political life, the good life, and the moral life should be. The account of the good life in politics is accompanied by an account of what is true and epistemology. The purpose of this little section that I'm reading here in this video is to show that one's view in one area of philosophy, if they are relativistic, can show up in the other areas of philosophy or in areas of inquiry that may lie outside of philosophy proper. So I want to focus on the relationship between McIntyre's account of political ethics and his epistemology. I will argue that while I believe that McIntyre's advocacy of an Aristotelian Thomistic account of the political ethics is praiseworthy, I believe that it cannot be reasonably maintained given McIntyre's epistemology, at least one version of it. Because McIntyre's epistemology has elements, at least one version of it, that tend towards epistemic relativism. I believe that this militates against that which is true in McIntyre's political ethics. So there are three features of good political life that are consistent with McIntyre's political views: Aristotelian, Thomism, and utopianism. First is the Aristotelian conception of virtue in the individual and virtue in the polis, which comes to us by way of the Nicomachean ethics. Human good turns out to be activity of the soul in conformity with virtue or excellence in a complete life. It's from Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics. Part of that complete life involves external goods, including political human relationships. So this leads to the second element of McIntyre's political ethics, and that's Thomism. Adding to what is known by faith to Aristotle's claims about the good life known by natural reason, Aquinas agrees that this life contains imperfect happiness and requires external goods, but that perfect happiness does not. Man needs in this life the necessaries of the body, this is quoting from the Summa, both for the operation of contemplative virtue and for the operation of active virtue. On the other hand, such goods as these are nowise necessary for perfect happiness, which consists in seeing God, which will be either in the soul separated from the body or in the soul united to the body, then no longer animal but spiritual. Consequently, these external goods are nowise necessary for that happiness, since they are ordained to the animal life. So for Aquinas, external goods are not necessary for perfect happiness, which is found in the beatific vision. So the third thing, we have Aristotelianism, Thomism, and then utopianism. Third, there's a kind of utopianism present in McIntyre's works, which he touches on at the end of After Virtue, as a longing for a new Saint Benedict. The Benedictine rule contains within it a kind of communal living. Such communalism is surely possible, and one literary reference takes the following form. A vision of such a utopian communal economy is present in George MacDonald's A Shop in Heaven, which is an account of a dream that had by one of the characters in MacDonald's novel, Thomas Wingfold Curate. So what I'm doing here is taking McIntyre's notion of utopianism, and which is in his work a form of communalism, living life together in community, and then showing how George MacDonald's a dream of a shop in heaven in his novel Thomas Wingfold Curate kind of embodies that. Okay, this might not be McIntyre's view, but it's an extension I'm offering as what I think is a nice illustration of the utopianism that's present in McIntyre's political ethics, political philosophy. So one of George MacDonald's characters in Thomas Wingfold Curate relates a dream in which he was led by a heavenly guide into a marketplace of shops in heaven, which he describes as a place where, in the economic exchanges of one to another, this is quoting here, a man could perfectly read the countenance of every neighbor. There was no seeking there, but a strength of giving, business-like earnestness to supply lack, enlivened by no haste, and dulled by no weariness, brightened ever by the reflective content of those who found their wants supplied. Pleasure to see how everyone knew what his desire was, making his choice readily and with decision, which came not of individual knowledge, but of universal faith and all-embracing love. End quote. So now the dreamer here questions, after he's reporting this dream to a friend, how it's possible that these happy people do their business and pass from hand to hand not a single coin. The reason given is this. So the dreamer's in his dream, he's with a guide who walks into the shop, and he sees all these people just seeming to have this economic utopian system where everyone is giving each other what they need without exchanging any money. And the guide in dreams says this: where greed and ambition and self-love rule, money must be. Where there is neither greed nor ambition nor self-love, money is needless. Whether neither greed nor ambition nor selflessness reigneth, their need and desire have free scope, for they work no evil. It is never advantage to himself that moveth a man in this kingdom to undertake this or that. The thing that alone advantages a man here is the thing which he does without thought unto that advantage. So that one prays, give me, friend, of thy loaves. The man answered, take of them, friend, as many as thou needest. Is that, I say, an incentive to diligence less potent than the desire to hoard or to excel? Is it not to share the bliss of God, who hoards nothing, but ever gives liberally? The joy of man here is to enable another to lay hold of that upon which is of his own kind, and be glad and grow thereby. End quote. So the Thomistic beatific vision enables one to be filled with an all-embracing love of God, through direct and unmediated awareness of the divine. Although not necessary for complete happiness, according to Thomas, external goods of the kind described by MacDonald in this utopian vision of heaven could be present in a utopian conception of political heaven as aspects of human life that were part and parcel of human nature. This type of utopian heavenly political economy may well fit the utopian telos embodied in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition with which McIntyre sympathizes. So now the question then arises of the possibility of our knowledge of this type of utopia. As an item of knowledge, we now have to turn to the four main features of McIntyre's epistemology, and they are as follows. Okay, so now we're shifting from McIntyre's political philosophy, his political ethics of Aristotelianism, Thomism, and utopianism, and then I want to show that maybe there's some tensions with McIntyre's epistemology. So here are four features of McIntyre's epistemology. Now again, this might be a certain time slice of McIntyre's work, and I did most of my research on this in the late 90s, so if McIntyre shifted his view, and he probably did, maybe not totally satisfactory to reject all these four things, but at least at this time, these were what I understood to be McIntyre's epistemology. 1. Having knowledge and being rational are dependent on certain perspectival aspects of one tradition or another. 2. There's no neutral or supra or a-traditional way to evaluate competing knowledge or rationality claims. 3. There can be rational defeat of one tradition by another. And 4. An Aristotelian Thomistic tradition is superior to other traditions. So now McIntyre claims that given his commitment to 3 and 4, 1 and 2 above do not lead to relativism. This account, the accounts given throughout McIntyre's work on traditions, on how traditions defeat one another by demonstrating their problem-solving ability vis-a-vis the lights of the other tradition, show relativism simply doesn't follow. However, it seems that there may be an inconsistency in maintaining the idea that there's no neutral way to evaluate competing knowledge or rationality claims, and there can be a rational defeat of one's tradition by another. There seems to be some tension there. It is inconsistent to maintain that there's no neutral account of rationality and to give a normative account of how traditions defeat one another. If there's no tradition-neutral account of rationality, then there could be no tradition-neutral account of how traditions can rationally defeat one another. Although it is an empirical fact that traditions do in fact interact, an account of the nature of such interactions that is transcendent must, according to McIntyre, be a description that is only justified within some particular tradition. If rationality is relative, then everything about rationality, including principles by which one tradition rationally defeats another, is also relative. Now, McIntyre is telling us the real condition of human inquiry is in a non-tradition bound sense. And feature 3, which is the idea that there can be rational defeat of one tradition by another, presupposes a real non-tradition bound way of telling us the real condition of human inquiry. This is precisely what his feature 2 denies. That is, there's no neutral way to evaluate competing knowledge or rationality claims. So one might claim that while the idea that there can be rational defeat of one tradition by another, that itself is only true from within the tradition in which it's made, nevertheless it can be shown to apply to other traditions, just in case one tradition defeats another in the way outlined above. However, this presupposes that McIntyre's account of truth, the truth of the idea that there can be rational defeat of one tradition by another, is correct. If someone from a tradition different from McIntyre's who maintains that this is not correct is confronted with McIntyre's claim that it is correct, then how is one to adjudicate between them? According to the second principle that McIntyre maintains, that there's no neutrality, then how is one to adjudicate between these two? According to the idea that there's no neutrality, there can be no appeal to some standard that is neutral between both traditions. So the idea that there can be rational defeat of one tradition by another seems to be functioning as something that is neutral between traditions. But according to his other principle, there's no such thing. So this appears inconsistent to maintain there's no neutrality, and that we can describe accurately the idea that there can be rational defeat of one tradition by another. So while McIntyre's work shows excellent examples of the interaction and conflicts between and within traditions, there's a real difficulty in offering any extra-traditional account or extra-traditional justification of the correctness of his own account of such confrontation and interaction. As Scott Smith writes, McIntyre's, quote, intent is on giving us not just a statement of how things are for his way of life, but rather a full-blown attempt to persuade others that his is how they ought to see the world. End quote. Thus, there is a difficulty of providing a consistent, non-relative account of how rationality should operate. So now, returning to the application of McIntyre's epistemology to our knowledge of a political utopian summum bonum, let's call this the USB, utopian summum bonum. That's a strange thing to say. But suppose that we return to that idea, our knowledge of a USB. Then his claims above can't reasonably establish that kind of USB that McIntyre might envision, or any other concept of a USB, for that matter. For our purposes, here, with respect to the discussion of the greatest good, the proposition above that having knowledge and being rational are dependent, are tradition dependent, would entail this. I'm calling this one star here. With respect to what the ultimate good for human life is, the utopian summum bonum, a belief P about USB, can only be made within some tradition, whether religious or otherwise, some tradition T, where T provides the standards of evaluation such that P is judged to be the USB only within the constraints of the standards of epistemic justification within that tradition. That entails call this 2 star here, given a different tradition, T star, where USB in T is rejected and USB star is accepted, there is no neutral way to determine which standard of justification to use to determine whether one should accept USB or USB star. So those two, taken together, entail that the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition-bound concept of the USB can, or will, defeat all other present or future logically possible concepts of the USB. But it appears that these propositions, taken together as a philosophical view, may still fall prey to a simple reductio argument against relativism. Okay, suppose I take all of that and just call that P. If P is a possible position that is reasonable to believe, then the advocate of P must have good reasons for holding to it. If there are good reasons for holding to P, then those good reasons are neutral, by definition of good reasons. But according to P itself, it's not the case that those good reasons are neutral. Therefore, according to the advocate of P, there are no good reasons for holding to P. Therefore, there are not good reasons for holding to P. That's when your view of things, your epistemology ends up in a reductio, something's gone wrong. Okay. Further, P is a belief that is found within a belief system B, call this B1, held by the advocate of P, which contains internal to it its own standards of justification, call those S1 to S sub n. But it's possible that on some other belief system B2, with standards of justification S sub 1 star through S sub n star, P is not justified. P might be justified within B1, but not justified within B2. Further, the advocate of P on her own grounds must add that there's no neutral way to adjudicate between B1 and B2 in order to establish P or not P. But this implies that there are no good reasons to accept P. Thus, an advocacy of these principles fails. Therefore, no rational establishment of the USB can be made if these principles are maintained. So I believe that McIntyre's principles here entail a problematic form of epistemic relativism if it cannot be reasonably applied to a theory of politics. If one wants to have a conception of the good political life, then the thing to do is just drop the feature that McIntyre seems to hold on to. And that is the feature that there's no neutral or supra or a-traditional way to evaluate competing knowledge or rationality claims. Just drop that from your epistemology. Do that, problem solved. This seems to cause all the relativistic worries that accompany McIntyre's account of knowledge and its application to a utopian summum bonum to disappear. There are several possible things that dropping the idea of no neutrality might entail. First, dropping the idea of no neutrality could lead to a return to the strong rationalistic Cartesian project of searching for an ultimate criteria for all knowledge, the type of which Descartes sought in his clarity and distinctness. Now, look, this I don't think this is the route to go, but it is a possibility. While the search for one ultimate criterion of clarity and distinctness has proved a failure, what has managed to survive from this Cartesian project is a portion of that search which is still with us today. the denial of the possibility of allowing our minds to be connected to the world in a comprehensive fashion, which the ontological reality, and thus the epistemic reality, of so-called secondary qualities is rejected. Now that's found in Galileo, in his tickled statues, in Descartes' smelly wax, Locke's hot fire, Berkeley's warm water, and right up to the Kantian notion that we can never get to things as they are in themselves. There is in modern philosophy a strong denial of the possibility of allowing our minds to connect rightly with the world. There's a general disappearance of the acceptance of the reality of so-called secondary qualities. And this denial leads Berkeley in his own way and Kant in his, to a complete denial of both the secondary and primary qualities being possible objects of knowledge as they are in themselves. This unhappy road, it seems to me, moves from the denial of simple common phenomenal experiences like colors or felt qualities, and moves directly and irrevocably into a denial of objective reality of moral qualities in Hume. And this loss, I believe, makes impossible an objectivity of knowledge of either a temporal or eternal political utopia. Okay, so one way you could say is, look, we're going to drop to, and then we're going to go a Cartesian or modern route, looking for a criteria, but that's cut off from reality. Now, that's a mistake. So here's maybe another option. Give up the idea of no neutrality. That could entail moving to a stronger rejection of knowledge as possible altogether. Okay, now this one I don't think is a good idea either. Now, this might be something that people further down the relativistic road, like Richard Rorty, might do. Now, Rorty was sympathetic with McIntyre's feature 2, which is the idea that there's no neutral or tradition-independent way to evaluate competing knowledge claims. Commenting on McIntyre's epistemology, Putnam says, "For unless a knowledge of the function of the human species takes us beyond McIntyre's Socratic claims, that the good life for man is the life spent seeking for the good life for man, the idea of one narrative being more objective and authoritative than another, as opposed to being more detailed and inclusive, goes by the board." So following Rorty to give up no neutrality is something we know could be consistent with a radical rejection of the possibility of knowledge such in preference for something else altogether. Right? This is like, I don't know, throwing a baby out with the bathwater, I guess, the nature, so it was back to Rorty. In other words, you just reject rationality altogether, truth with it. The nature of truth is an unprofitable topic, according to Rorty. But this claim about relative profitability, in turn, is just the recommendation that we, in fact, say little about these topics and see how we get on. just give up truth. So just don't talk about that anymore. Now, this rejection of 2 leads more into a relativistic morass than accepting, and thus that should be rejected, as McIntyre himself recognizes, right? So thankfully McIntyre doesn't go the Rortyian route. Here's what McIntyre says about Rorty. Perhaps at its most fundamental level, I can state the disagreement between Rorty and myself in the following way. His dismissal of objective or rational standards emerges from the writing of genealogical history. But at once the question arises of whether he has written a history that is in fact true. And to investigate the question, I should want to argue is to discover that the practice of writing true history requires implicit or explicit references to standards of objectivity and rationality of just the kind that the initial genealogical history was designed to discredit. That's from McIntyre's work in the early 80s. Let's see what the reference was. McIntyre, 1982, it's Philosophy and History article from Analyse and Critic, Volume 4, in the early 80s. Good times, early 80s. Well, McIntyre recognized that Rorty's route of rejecting the idea of no neutrality in favor of something else entirely relativistic was a mistake. So since returning to Cartesian hopes for a single criterion, coupled with a rejection of the possibility of the mind's connection with that which is real, and a rejection of the possibility of knowledge as such, are non-starters, what are we to do? There are other ways to make progress towards our knowledge and acquisition of a political utopian summum bonum. We need to reject 2. You have to reject the idea that there's no neutrality. You just have to do it. This is my view now. We have to reject two in favor of an epistemology in which there is neutrality between any competing epistemic traditions. Such an account would require three things. One, a strong view of human essentialism about personhood, using the resources of Aristotelian Thomistic essentialism in biology and in psychology and in human nature. Two, a return to the objectivity of knowledge. And three, a return to the objectivity of value. First, so let me walk through these things. First, a rejection of the second feature of McIntyre's epistemology can be plausibly accomplished just in case there is an essential human nature shared by all rational beings. If human beings share an essential human nature, rational animality, or the imago Dei, this may serve as a neutral sameness by means of which the disputes in morality or politics, or even about knowledge itself, can be adjudicated. Now, a full-blown account of Aristotelian Thomistic view of personhood is well beyond the scope of this work, but the way forward on such an account is solvable in principle simply by comparing the explanatory power of materialist physicalist accounts of human nature with those of an Aristotelian Thomistic one on such areas as the unity of the self at a time and across time and with respect to freedom of the will. In the first area, the unity of the self, for example, an Aristotelian account of the reality of teleology and natural organisms has great explanatory power in making sense of the available data that explains the role and function of genetic information, as well as law-like progress apparent in organic growth. For more recent work on this, look at David Oderberg's work on essentialism. It's brilliant. Just go read it. Anything you can get your hands on by him is going to be worth your time. As well as a properly developed Aristotelian account of the soul provides a necessary component for the possibility of the universality of knowledge across human inquiries, even if those inquiries are epistemically tradition dependent, which I reject anyway. So, okay. Second, a rejection of the idea of no neutrality can be safely accomplished just in case an account of the objectivity of knowledge can be defended along both epistemic and ontologically realistic lines. Such an account would maintain that knowledge is an act or disposition of representing things as they are on an appropriate basis of thought and experience. Again, that's not my idea, that's Dallas Willard's. Now, such an account would have three features. One, knowledge is an act or disposition of representing things. This first component requires a realistic non-causal account of perception, such that the mind is directly and immediately, say goodbye to the modern notion of ideas, aware of the objects it is perceiving. Two, knowledge represents things as they are. This account of knowledge requires a strong correspondence theory of truth set up along metaphysically realistic lines, which pays careful attention to the real phenomenology of truth in our ordinary experiences. If you want to see my book on theories of truth and introduction, I wrote it after I wrote this book. Check it out. I have a book length defense of that account of truth there. If there's to be any account of a political utopian sunum bonum, this account must be able to rest on an adequate theory of truth, such that the account given can be seen to be true by any serious inquirer. We do this all the time in common sense activities. I tell you where the bookstore is, you represent where the bookstore is in your mind, you move through the world to see if your idea matches reality, you see that your idea of where the bookstore is matches reality, you experience as you stand in front of the bookstore. If we can do this with bookstores, it doesn't seem to me impossible to do this with other places we long for, like a political utopian summum bonum. 3. Representing things as they are, of course, must be done on an appropriate basis of thought and experience. It is this level of what is often called epistemic justification that seems rather vague in the notion of knowledge advocated here. Perhaps this is not such a bad thing. The appropriateness of standards of justification may simply be pegged to the area of inquiry. I don't go looking for my eternal soul in the same way I go looking for my Kia soul. If you don't know the difference between your eternal soul and your Kia soul, you've got problems. Justification might still be foundational, but it is dependent on the subject matter in question. This type of account of the objectivity of knowledge, if plausible, will go a long way in replacing the idea that there's no neutrality between competing standards of evaluation in McIntyre's epistemology. So this brings us to the third requirement for an epistemology that rejects McIntyre's no neutrality idea, which allows us to maintain a clear vision for a utopian summum bonum. The objectivity of value is largely lost in our culture today. Yep, whatever one's opinion of Alan Bloom's Closing the American Mind, traditionalists and progressive professors alike can, through reflection on their most recent experiences in teaching any introductory course in philosophy, readily agree with Bloom that one thing that is true of undergraduates is that they are nearly, without exception, ethical, if not total, philosophical relativists. Without an account of the objectivity of value, which is dependent on an objective epistemology sketched above, no progress is possible for knowledge of the political utopian summum bonum whatsoever. As Relativism Williamson writes, the tricky thing about the objectivity of value is that it cannot be proved. It might be conceded that if mortal man is the ultimate source of all truth and is, as Protagoras, the first relativist, taught the measure of all things, that is the best answer, that politics should be solely based on consent rather than objective moral truths, that one could give. Nevertheless, it is not nearly good enough. In the first place, it is not true that there are no values above and beyond man. It is not a valid argument against the existence of absolute values to assert that we cannot prove that they exist to someone who doubts it, or to cite numerous cases in which men have been mistaken in identifying and applying them. There are a great many things in this world which are true and yet undemonstrable. It is in the sight of the onlooker which is the fault, and not the visibility of the object. Now, that's awesome. It's from Relativism Williamson. I'm going to repeat that. It is the sight of the onlooker which is at fault, not the visibility of the object. Back to my ideas. The real foundation for human reasoning itself, our knowledge of what is real, good, true, beautiful, and our knowledge of any political good life, requires that there be a real objective moral order, and we can know and appropriate that into our moral and social lives. In his exposition of the philosophical points of Veritatis Splendor, the encyclical, McIntyre himself specifies the 3 points made here. 1, the need for an essentialist account of human nature. 2, the explication of the objectivity of knowledge. And 3, a commitment to the objectivity of value. McIntyre writes this. Insofar as the conception of human nature which we arrive at is indeed that of a human nature as structured by the natural law, we will have succeeded in transcending what is peculiar to our own or any other culture. It will have become a conception of that which is itself a measure of culture, of that in human beings which shows that they are not exhaustively defined by their culture and are not its prisoner. So once again, a connection between truth and freedom appears. Just as we are not to be explained as wholly determined by our physical and biological makeup, so we are not merely products of our cultural environment, but actual and potential creative shapers of it, precisely insofar as we can evaluate its perspective in terms which are non-perspectival, in terms of truth. Now, McIntyre here has pinpointed the philosophical commitments required to eliminate this feature of no neutrality in his own epistemology, at least at one point of it. Those of us who've learned a great deal from McIntyre's work will continue to explore his philosophy in this direction with him, in order to avoid the logical and practical problems associated with relativism as applied to political theories. Thanks for watching.
Stay psyched, Grom. Woo!